Chapter 9, Sonnets from the Portuguese, page 90. The 7th and 8th grades, which our special progress class did in 1 year, were remarkable only in that I had no major fights, and for the oppression of my father. I ended the year glad to be released from the hot classrooms, but with few prospects for the summer. I had fewer friends than ever, having lost anything of common interest with the boys on my block who were my age. Boys slightly older were moving on to girls and dating and fitting in with the mores and restrictions of being in their mid-teens, which meant, among other things, avoiding associations with younger boys. I was 12 and going into 9th grade of what would today be called a gifted program, while many of the other kids my age were just going into their 7th. The only sport I was playing now was basketball, often with guys 4 or 5 years older than I was. Basketball was very satisfying. It gave me a chance to compete, which I loved, and it was highly respected in the community. A good basketball player would be known throughout Harlem. Beyond the idea of winning, which was important to me, I liked the physical aspects of playing ball. Going up for a rebound and snatching it off the backboard over an opponent was a thrill. To even get into one of the tough summer tournaments with players coming from as far away as Philadelphia was sheer delight. My sister Imogene had come to Harlem to live with George Myers. She was bright, beautiful, and feisty, but like Mickey, she was not allowed out of the house that much. I wanted her to see me play ball in the worst way, but she could never get to the better games that I managed to play in. I did show her some of my poetry, which she liked. I thought Jean, as we called her, was a lot like me, and began wondering more often about my biological family was like. Mr. Lasher had convinced me that I was bright, and by the time I approached the 9th grade, education had become very important to me. There was far less pretense in the New York City school system than there is today. High schools were divided into 4 general categories: vocational, commercial, general, and academic. Only 25% of all male students attended academic high schools and were expected to go on to college. The rest, even if they did graduate from high school, were expected to take their place in the workforce immediately. The dropout rate was quite high, but it didn't seem to matter all that much. Most jobs could be handled by anyone with a willingness to work and some reading ability. But I knew that a poor education would probably land me in a Negro job, that lower level of employment in which so many of the neighborhood men seemed to be hopelessly stuck. By this time there were 2 very distinct voices going on in my head, and I moved easily between them. One had to do with sports, street life, and establishing myself as a male. It was a fairly rough voice, the kind of in-your-face tone that said I wouldn't stand for too much nonsense either on the basketball courts or in the streets. The other voice, the one I hid from my street friends and teammates, was increasingly dealing with the vocabulary of literature. Harlem had a rich literature heritage, of which I knew nothing. The so-called Harlem Renaissance, which produced writers such as Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, and Courtney Cullen, had ended during the Depression of the 30s, and none of the writers were taught in city schools. Moreover, there were a few black librarians. I remember none in the George Bruce branch who might have recommended any of these writers to me. I spent the summer with my time divided between playing basketball and reading. In ball, I was helped briefly by a thin black man called Fatty, who was the coach of the team called the Camachans, one of the best teams in the city. He talked to me about the possibility of playing ball in college, and I was encouraged. When I wasn't playing ball, I read everything I could get my hands on. The reading was largely indiscriminate. At the library, I'd pick up a novel, read a page or 2, then make a quick decision as to whether or not I wanted to borrow it. When a librarian at the George Bruce branch commented that I probably wasn't reading all the books I took out, I began to space out my visits. I wanted her to think that I was a reader. Mary Finley was our teacher in the 9th grade. Never had I seen a teacher with such high hopes, or one who would be so bitterly disappointed. The class had been together for a year, and she was the outsider. The first week of the new term set the tone for the whole year. Leon Sandoff's father ran a kiosk on Amsterdam just off 125th Street, and we got 9 plugs of chewing tobacco from him. The idea was hatched during one morning. The plugs acquired at lunchtime, and the chewing began right after lunch. None of us had ever chewed tobacco before, and while we thought it was a good idea, is beyond me to this day. I can't remember the first boy who threw up, but I do remember Mrs. Finley's face when the rest of us started spitting out our tobacco wads. The class in the middle of history lecture broke out into a group of retching, spitting 13-year-old boys, with the girls retreating to the open windows for air. Mrs. Finley was on the verge of tears and absolutely speechless. Her dismay, along with the disgust of the girls, made the whole venture worthwhile, even as we had to clean up the mess we made with rags and buckets of water brought up by the cleaning staff. Mrs. Finley tried to minimize the damage by saying that one of the boys had become ill and made the other sick. But the next week there was a spitball fight in our typing class, which blew our cover. The girls, after the tobacco incident, were somewhat envious of our notoriety. When Mr. Goldstein, the typing teacher, left the room and the spitball fight restarted, the girls joined in with a vengeance. Mr. Goldstein was not amused when he returned to see the typing room, including his desk, covered with spitballs. The word quickly got around the school that the SP students were troublemakers, and Mr. Manley, our French teacher, explained to us in no little detail how disgusting we were and what an educational opportunity we were wasting. Mr. Manley was also the only black teacher we had. Mrs. Finley was our homeroom teacher and also taught English. I thought she was boring, that is, until we came to the sonnets of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. We had to read sonnets before, but Mrs. Finley, reading Browning's poems, gave them new meaning. If thou must love me, let it be for naught, except for love's sake only. Do not say, I love her for her smile, her look, her way of speaking gently, for a trick of thought. Mrs. Finley introduced us first to the life of Elizabeth Barrett. Here was a sickly woman who lived much of her life alone, and who wrote poetry from the time she was a child. The poems we read in class were her expressions of love to Robert Browning, her husband. The poetry was personal, and I was able to understand it as personal expression by the writer rather than as what seemed to me to be the interpretation of writing of the earlier poems that I had read. Perhaps someone could be so moved by a Grecian urn that he would instantly sit down and write a poem about it, but the idea of writing to someone you loved was immediately attractive to me. The poetry had come from Browning, as well as being written by her. Sonnets from the Portuguese, used from form and meter with an ease and grace that I envied. I wanted to write like Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I wanted to sit by my window, my small dog on my lap, and write this intensely personal poetry. The sonnet form allowed me to take my poems, look and feel like real poetry without being as distinct as some of the other British poetry I had read. Mrs. Finley assigned us the task of writing a sonnet. I wrote dozens of sonnets. Mrs. Finley told me to put them in a notebook, and I did, writing them first on scrap paper, and then, when they were as perfect as I needed them to be, carefully copying them out into my poetry notebook. She took us from the sonnets of Browning to the sonnets of Shakespeare, which I found difficult. Where Browning was straightforward and using clear Shakespearean was devious, never being quite where you wanted him to be. When the class complained about how difficult it was to read Shakespeare's sonnets, we were challenged to learn enough to understand his references and to be mentally alert enough to see his puns and his layers of ideas. I tried writing a few poems a la Shakespeare, but quickly returned to Browning. That Christmas, Mrs. Finley gave me a paperback copies of both the comedies and tragedies of Shakespeare. As the holiday season neared, my dad seemed finally to shake his blues. On his payday, we drove downtown to Division Street and brought presents for my sisters, and he actually kidded around with Mama. She pretended to be annoyed, but I knew she was greatly relieved. So was I. After Christmas, we read more British poetry. To many of my classmates, Mrs. Finley's dramatic readings of the English poets were comical, and I went along with laughing at her, but secretly, I wanted to be an English poet. I wrote more sonnets and odes to everything imaginable. Ode to the summer rain, ode to the leafy sycamore tree, ode to a church steeple. I was filling more and more my notebooks. The prints we saw of Shelley and Byron were among ethereal young white men with flowing hair. Mrs. Finley made them sound as if they were naturally brilliant, and I studied the images, trying to discern who they were. It was clear they were no one I had ever known. Each class had to do an assembly program for the entire school. Our first effort was a Japanese play called The Stolen Prince. The play was in na form. A narrator told the story, but the actors were silent. A property man, dressed in black, moved items around the stage, concealed by his dark clothing, lighting, and the imagination of the audience. In The Stolen Prince, I was the property man, and I also played a penny whistle, in an imitation of a Japanese music for atmosphere. This was a class of fiendishly bright kids who knew just how bright they were. Mrs. Finley wanted us to behave like young scholars she imagined us to be. We wouldn't. We behaved badly at every turn and received more class reprimands than any other class in the school's history. Kids wouldn't move to the right places during rehearsals, or would ad-lib wisecracks, which Mrs. Finley didn't think at all funny. On the day we were to perform the play, she was virtually in tears. The play she saw as a gentle incursion into another culture that we played as a comic romp with great effect. The school principal, who knew our bad behavior reports, had come to the play and loved it. We were asked to perform it 2 more times. Sometime during the school year, we had to choose which high school we wanted to attend. The only boy who had the idea of which school he wanted to go to was Edward Norton, whose brother John went to Stuyvesant High School. The 5 guys on the class basketball team, including my friend Eric, took the test for Stuyvesant, and we all passed. The next day we did it for an assembly, was an enactment, totally adapted by Mrs. Finley, I believe with the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. The whole class had to memorize the poem, and we were all assigned roles. Roberto Limbo, who took dance classes after school, did the choreography. The Coleridge poem gave me a new idea about writing. The rim of the Ancient Mariner did not have the elegance of any of the sonnets we had read, nor did it have the soaring language of a poem by Shelley or Byron. It was poetry designed to tell a tale. When we were in the 7th and 8th grades, Mr. Steinfeld had read with us some narrative poetry that told of his historical events, most notably the charge of the Light Brigade. But the Coleridge epic had something more. It had a symbolism that wasn't in other poems, and it also involved the poet's ideas about the moral responsibility of the mariner. He was the one who had shot the albatross, and yet in the end we pitied him. I was learning how many ways poetry could have meaning. A few years later, sailing in the Arctic waters similar to the ones that Coleridge described, I was surprised to find out that some of what I considered to be merely fancy writing by Coleridge was actually fairly accurate descriptions of natural phenomena. Mrs. Finley was one of the few teachers I felt sorry for. She was willing to give so much more than we were willing to take. At the end of the year, she reminded us how bright we all were and how it was our responsibility to do something with that brightness. The school's opinion of the experiment with the special classes for bright kids was clearly negative, she explained. We had made light of all the advantages we had been given, and we had treated the school with disdain, or so it seemed. But I also think that all the kids in that SP class took something away very special. The notion that each of us had an intellectual gift to spend as we chose. While I had moved more into writing and into reading, I was moving further and further away from my parents. I did write some poems, which I showed my parents. Mama said they were nice, and asked me to explain one of them, which I did. She said that my dad had liked them too. I was disappointed. I think I wanted to hear him, in his kindness, say those words. What I did not know about my father was that he couldn't read.